The telegram arrived at Winston Churchill's war rooms on a fog-shrouded London morning. In January 1944, its contents would change the course of human history. Operation Overlord approved. Full allied. Commitment authorized. Churchill's cigar trembled slightly as he read the words. That would unleash the largest seaborne invasion in military history. General Dwight David Eisenhower stood before the massive wall map in his Portsmouth headquarters, studying the Normandy coastline with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient's x-ray. The beaches stretched before him like a puzzle of death and opportunity sword. Juneau, Gold, Omaha, and Utah, each name would soon be etched in blood and glory. The Supreme Allied Commander knew that the fate of Western civilization rested on the success of this audacious plan. The genesis of D-Day traced back to the dark days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against the Nazi juggernaut. After Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, Allied leaders knew that victory would require a second front in Europe. Stalin's relentless pressure from the east demanded relief, and the only way to achieve it was through the belly of occupied France. Planning for Operation Overlord began in earnest during 1943, with Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan leading the initial design phase. The challenge was staggering: how to transport over 150,000 men across the treacherous English Channel, establish a beachhead against Adolf Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall, and sustain the largest military operation in history. According to Winston Churchill's wartime memoirs, the Prime Minister initially favored a more cautious approach, but American generals pushed for the bold cross-channel assault. The deception campaign, codenamed Operation Bodyguard, became a masterpiece of military misdirection. Allied intelligence created an entirely fictional First United States Army group, complete with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and General George Smith Patton Jr. as its supposed commander. The Germans, convinced that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, concentrated their strongest defenses there while leaving Normandy relatively vulnerable. Behind the scenes, an unprecedented logistical miracle unfolded across Britain. American General Omar Nelson Bradley oversaw the transformation of southern England into a vast military staging area. Airfields sprouted like mushrooms, harbors groaned under the weight of landing craft, and roads trembled beneath endless convoys of men and materiel. The statistics defied comprehension: 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and troops from 12 different nations. The human element proved equally complex. Eisenhower faced the delicate task of coordinating allied egos and national interests. British General Bernard Law Montgomery would command all ground forces during the initial phase, while American Admiral Chester William Nimitz's Pacific experience influenced naval planning. French General Charles de Gaulle demanded recognition for free French forces, adding political complexity to military necessity. Training intensified as spring arrived. British beaches from Devon to Scotland echoed with the sound of landing craft hitting sand as Allied troops rehearsed their deadly choreography. Exercise Tiger at Slapton Sands turned tragic when German E-boats attacked the rehearsal, killing over 700 men. A grim preview of the costs ahead. The incident highlighted the invasion's greatest vulnerability: the need for absolute surprise. At precise timing. Weather became the wild card in Eisenhower's calculations. The invasion required specific conditions: a full moon for paratroopers, low tide for beach obstacles, and calm seas for landing craft. Group Captain James Martin Stagg, the chief meteorologist, found himself holding the fate of nations in his weather forecasts. The original date of June 5th looked impossible due to storms, forcing the agonizing decision to delay. As May turned to June, the coiled spring of Allied preparation reached maximum tension. In camps across southern England, chaplains held final services while soldiers wrote last letters home. The magnitude of what lay ahead weighed on every man, from private to general. They carried with them not just weapons and equipment, but the hopes of enslaved peoples from Norway to Greece, from Poland to France. The stage was set for the greatest gamble in military history. Success would open the road to Berlin and Nazi defeat. Failure would prolong the war indefinitely and potentially hand Hitler victory through a negotiated peace. Everything depended on the next few hours of June 6, 1944. The rain drummed against the windows of Southwick House. As General Eisenhower faced the most momentous decision of his career, it was 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1944, and the weather forecast painted a picture of potential disaster. Group Captain Stagg delivered his grim assessment. "Sir, The conditions for June 5th remain impossible. Winds of force 5 to 6, heavy cloud cover, and rough seas. Eisenhower's weathered face betrayed nothing as he processed the implications. Over 150,000 men waited in sealed camps and aboard ships already at sea. The complex machinery of invasion, set in motion weeks earlier, could not simply be stopped and restarted without consequences. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, commanding the naval forces, reported that some vessels were already committed beyond the point of easy recall. The Supreme Commander's inner circle gathered around the polished table like generals in a medieval war. Counsel Montgomery, ever confident, argued for proceeding despite the weather. "We've trained for every condition," he insisted, his sharp features illuminated by the lamplight. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory countered with brutal arithmetic. "The Luftwaffe may be weakened, but storms could accomplish what Goring's fighters cannot scatter our formations and leave the beaches without air cover behind." The strategic calculations lay human drama of unprecedented scale. In camps throughout southern England, soldiers of the 1st, 4th, and 29th Infantry Divisions sat in their sealed compounds, playing cards, writing letters, and trying not to think about tomorrow. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions blackened their faces and checked their equipment for the 100th time. These men had been briefed on their objectives, shown sand tables of their landing zones, and given final instructions that many would never have the chance to follow. The Naval Armada represented the greatest assembly of ships in human history. Operation Neptune, the naval component of Overlord, involved over 6,000 vessels ranging from massive battleships to tiny landing craft. Admiral Ramsay's detailed planning accounted for every possible contingency except the one now threatening the entire enterprise: Mother Nature's refusal to cooperate. Ships already en route toward Normandy pitched and rolled in heavy seas. That would make beach landings treacherous, if not impossible. As documented in General Omar Bradley's memoir A Soldier's Story, the American 1st Army commander spent these crucial hours reviewing intelligence reports from the French resistance. The underground networks, coordinated by the Special Operations Executive and Office of Strategic Services, had provided invaluable information about German dispositions. Resistance fighters reported that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had departed Normandy for Germany, leaving the Atlantic Wall's architect absent during the invasion's critical window. The psychological pressure on individual soldiers reached its peak during these waiting hours. Corporal Samuel Fuller of the 1st Infantry Division later recalled the eerie quiet that settled over his unit as they waited aboard their landing craft. You could hear men praying in a dozen languages, he remembered. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and probably some atheists, all asking the same God to see them through the next 24 hours. At precisely 9:15 that evening, Eisenhower reconvened his commanders for the final weather briefing. Stagg's news brought a glimmer of hope. A brief break in the weather pattern might provide a narrow window on June 6th. The conditions would be marginal better than June 5th, but far from ideal. Winds would remain strong, cloud cover would persist, but the seas might calm enough for landing operations. The decision moment arrived with brutal clarity. Montgomery supported the attack, believing that surprise would compensate for poor conditions. The air commanders remained skeptical, knowing that cloud cover would hamper close air support. Naval leaders worried about rough seas, but acknowledged that delay meant losing the element of surprise entirely. Eisenhower rose from his chair and walked to the rain-streaked window. Outside, the storm that threatened to derail history continued its assault on the English countryside. After what seemed an eternity, he turned back to his commanders. "I don't like it, but we go," he said quietly. The words, barely audible above the rain, sealed the fate of millions and set in motion the events that would determine whether freedom or tyranny would shape the post-war world. The Handley Page Halifax bomber engines droned through the darkness as 18-year-old Private James Mitchell Gavin of the 82nd Airborne Division checked his parachute for the final time. Below the aircraft, the English Channel stretched like black silk, occasionally broken by white caps that caught the moonlight. In a few hours, those same waters would run red with the blood of the greatest invasion in human history. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, studied his watch in the dim red light of the aircraft cabin. 23 minutes past midnight, June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord had begun. The first Allied soldiers were already dropping into occupied France. 12,000 paratroopers and glider troops tasked with securing the flanks of the invasion beaches and creating chaos behind enemy lines. The Pathfinders had jumped first, their mission to mark drop zones for the main airborne assault. Among them was Master Sergeant William Tucker, whose Eureka beacon would guide the scattered formations of the 100th and 1st Airborne Division to their appointed landing zones. Tucker's small team represented the cutting edge of military technology, using radio beacons that seemed like science fiction compared to the trench warfare of their father's generation. As the aircraft crossed into French airspace, German flag began to pepper the sky. Tracer rounds streaked past windows as anti-aircraft guns awakened to the aerial armada above. The Luftwaffe, though weakened by years of attrition, still possessed enough night fighters to threaten the vulnerable transport aircraft. Several planes exploded in brilliant fireballs, taking their human cargo down into the Norman countryside. Major General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, felt his aircraft lurch as shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The red light beside the door flickered on, then green. Go, go, go. The jump master's voice cut through the engine noise as America's elite paratroopers hurled themselves into the darkness. Over St. Mire-Église, the drop proved catastrophic in its confusion and miraculous in its results. High winds, thick clouds, and German anti-aircraft fire scattered the airborne divisions across 50 miles of Norman country. Side units landed miles from their objectives. Officers found themselves commanding strangers, and carefully rehearsed plans dissolved in the chaos of night combat. According to Stephen Ambrose's D-Day, this dispersion actually aided the Allied cause by creating confusion among German defenders, who received reports of paratrooper landings from dozens of locations. Private John Steele of the 500th and 5th Parachute Infantry Regiment experienced the surreal horror of landing on the church steeple of St. Mire-Église. His parachute caught on the bell tower as German soldiers fought American paratroopers in the streets below. For 2 hours, he hung there like a grotesque ornament, playing dead while bullets whistled past his suspended form. His predicament would later symbolize the courage and vulnerability of the airborne assault. Colonel James Earl Rudder faced an even more daunting challenge. As his Rangers prepared to scale the cliffs of Point du Hoc, intelligence reported that German 155mm guns positioned there could devastate the Omaha and Utah Beach landings. Rudder's 125 men would have to climb 90-foot cliffs under enemy fire, destroy the gun positions, and hold their ground against counterattacks. The glider assault added another dimension to the airborne chaos. Massive, airspeed horse gliders, each carrying 30 troops or vital equipment, crash-landed in fields throughout the Cotentin Peninsula. Many gliders struck the Rommel asparagus, wooden poles, topped with mines that the German field marshal had ordered, planted in likely landing areas. The resulting crashes killed dozens of men before they could fire a shot, but the survivors quickly organized and began their missions. German response to the airborne assault revealed the fundamental weakness in their command structure. Field Marshal Rommel remained in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, while Hitler slept late and refused to be awakened with news of the invasion. Local commanders, forbidden to move reserves without permission from higher headquarters, watched helplessly as Allied paratroopers secured key bridges and crossroads. By dawn, nearly 12,000 Allied airborne troops were scattered across Normandy like seeds on fertile ground. Though few units had achieved their exact objectives, they had accomplished something equally valuable. They had seized the initiative and forced the Germans to react rather than implement their own plans. The first shells from HMS Warspite's 15-inch guns screamed across the pre-dawn darkness at 5:37 a.m., their orange muzzles flashes briefly illuminating the massive naval armada stretching beyond the horizon. The preliminary bombardment of Hitler's Atlantic Wall had begun, and with it, the most crucial phase of Operation Overlord. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay commanded the greatest naval force ever assembled from his flagship HMS Bilolo, over 800 warships, from mighty battleships to nimble destroyers, unleashed a thunderous barrage designed to pulverize German coastal defenses. The USS Nevada, veteran of Pearl Harbor, added her voice to the Steel Symphony, her 14-inch gun seeking targets along Utah Beach. The irony was not lost on her crew. The ship that had nearly died in the sneak attack now led America's righteous retribution. Captain Joseph Dawson of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment pressed his binoculars against his eyes as his landing craft pitched through 6-foot swells toward Omaha Beach. Through the spray and smoke, he could see the imposing bluffs that gave the beach its nickname among planners, Bloody Omaha. Intelligence had predicted light resistance, but the concrete bunkers and steel obstacles visible through the gloom suggested otherwise. The German defenders, initially stunned by the naval bombardment, began to respond with devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Goth, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division's strong points above Omaha, had drilled his men relentlessly for this moment. His machine gunners, protected by reinforced concrete and positioned for interlocking fields of fire, waited for the Allied infantry to enter their killing zones dotted Utah Beach. The landing began more favorably through a combination of skill and fortune. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., at 56 the oldest man to land on D-Day, waited ashore with the 4th Infantry Division's 8th Regiment. Strong currents had carried the landing craft over a mile south of their intended target, but Roosevelt's quick assessment revealed that the new position was actually better defended and more suitable for expansion inland. As documented in Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day, the first wave of assault troops faced obstacles that defied their worst nightmares. Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, and thousands of mines turned the beaches into death traps. Combat engineers of the 6th Naval Beach Battalion worked frantically to clear lanes through the obstacles while under intense fire, their casualty rate approaching 50% in the first hour. The human cost of the landings became immediately apparent at Omaha Beach, where Companies A and B of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment suffered catastrophic losses within minutes of landing. Captain Edward Wozinski's Company E was reduced to 42 men from its original strength of 205. The beach became a charnel house of destroyed landing craft, burning vehicles, and wounded men calling for medics who were themselves casualties. Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding the 5th Corps' assault on Omaha, received increasingly desperate radio reports from his units ashore. Troops pinned down on beach crackled one transmission. Heavy casualties, unable to advance, reported another. By 10 a.m., the situation appeared so critical that Admiral Omar Bradley aboard the USS Augusta considered abandoning Omaha Beach entirely and redirecting follow-up waves to other sectors. The breakthrough at Omaha came through individual acts of heroism rather than coordinated tactics. Staff Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 2nd Ranger Battalion led a small group up the bluffs west of the beach, using hand grenades and bayonets to clear German positions. His success inspired other small groups to attempt similar flanking movements, gradually weakening the German defensive line. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces of the 3rd Infantry Division encountered fierce resistance from the 716th Infantry Regiment, but pressed forward with characteristic determination. The Regina Rifle Regiment, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks, fought through the seaside town of Courseulles-sur-Mer house by house, their maple leaf insignia marking Canada's contribution to European liberation. The tide of battle began to turn as naval gunfire observers ashore began directing accurate fire on German positions. The destroyer USS McCook closed to within 800 yards of shore, her 5-inch guns systematically destroying bunkers that had been holding up the advance. Similar close support from HMS Belfast and other warships gradually tipped the balance in favor of the attackers. Colonel James Earl Rutter's Rangers scaled the 90-foot cliffs of Point du Hoc like deadly spiders, their Tommy guns slung across their backs and daggers clenched between their teeth. Below them, the English Channel crashed against jagged rocks. Above them, German defenders threw potato masher grenades that exploded in brilliant flashes against the cliff face of the 225 Rangers who began the assault. Only 90 would answer roll call at day's end. The discovery at the top of Point du Hoc would prove both disappointing and revelatory. The massive 155-millimeter guns that intelligence had identified as crucial threats to the invasion fleet were telephone poles and papier-match mock-ups. The real guns, found later in an apple orchard a mile inland, had been destroyed by the Rangers in a brief but vicious firefight. German deception had worked perfectly, except that American determinations had overcome it anyway. First Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, Jr. of the 16th Infantry Regiment embodied the individual heroism that turned the tide at Omaha Beach. Leading his men across the bullet-swept sand, Monteith repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire while organizing attacks on German strong points. When machine gun fire from a concrete bunker halted his advance, he personally led the assault that destroyed it, using hand grenades and rifle fire. He would die later that day, but his actions earned him the Medal of Honor and helped crack the German defensive line. The medical personnel who landed with the assault waves faced horrors that no training could have prepared them for. Captain Charles Shaughnessy, Chief Medical Officer of the 1st Infantry Division 16th Regiment, established the aid station in the lee of a destroyed landing craft, operating on wounded men while German artillery shells exploded around him. Medics like Private Robert Wright crawled across open ground under fire, dragging wounded soldiers to safety and administering morphine with hands stained by blood and sand. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division encountered latter resistance but faced their own unique challenges. The town of La Riviere became a fortress that had to be taken house by house. Company Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards single-handedly captured a German pillbox, then later, in the day led an attack on another strongpoint that was holding up the advance. His actions, which would earn him the Victoria Cross, exemplify the quiet courage of British infantry. According to Omar Bradley's post-war account in a general's life, the most critical moment of D-Day came at approximately 1 p.m. when he seriously considered evacuating Omaha Beach. Radio reports painted a picture of unmitigated disaster, units scattered, objectives unmet, casualties mounting. Only the personal intervention of seasoned NCOs and junior officers, men whose names would never appear in history books, prevented complete collapse. The breakthrough at Omaha began with small groups of soldiers who decided they would rather die advancing than lie pinned down on the beach. Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 2nd Ranger Battalion led one such group up a narrow draw between German strongpoints, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through wire obstacles. Other groups followed, creating multiple penetrations that the Germans could not contain. Captain Joseph Dawson's Company G of the 16th Infantry Regiment exemplified this determined advance. Starting the day with over 200 men, Dawson found himself leading fewer than 50 survivors in an attack on German positions above the beach. His men moved forward in short rushes, using every shell crater and piece of debris for cover. When his radio operator was killed, Dawson continued directing naval gunfire using hand signals to observers offshore. The German response to the breakthrough attempts revealed both their tactical skill and strategic blindness. Local commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Goff fought with professional competence, moving reserves to threatened sectors and coordinating counterattacks. However, the higher command structure remained paralyzed by Hitler's interference and Rommel's absence. Reserves that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea sat motionless, waiting for orders that never came. By mid-afternoon, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. Instead of clinging to precarious footholds on hostile beaches, Allied forces were expanding their perimeters and beginning to link up between sectors. The heroism of individual soldiers had overcome German defensive advantages, but at a terrible cost in young lives that would haunt the survivors forever. General Bernard Law Montgomery stood on the bridge of HMS Faulkner at 4 p.m., studying reports from his beach commanders with the methodical precision that had made him Britain's most celebrated field commander. The initial chaos of the landings was giving way to organized expansion as Allied forces pushed inland from their hard-won footholds. The most critical phase of Operation Overlord, establishing a sustainable beachhead, was succeeding despite horrific casualties. The link-up between Juneau and Gold Beaches came at 3:45 p.m. when patrols from the Canadian North Shore Regiment met advance elements of the British 50th Infantry Division near St. Albans-sur-Mer. The handshake between Sergeant William Anderson of Winnipeg and Corporal James Morrison of Yorkshire symbolized more than tactical success. It represented the beginning of a continuous Allied front in Western Europe. Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment delivered the day's most memorable leadership moment as his men hesitated under German fire. At Omaha Beach, "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach," he shouted above the din of battle, "the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His words, repeated throughout the regiment, encapsulated the brutal arithmetic of amphibious assault. Forward movement offered the only hope of survival. The German counterattack capability, so feared by Allied planners, proved remarkably limited due to command confusion and strategic miscalculation. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored reserve within striking distance of the beaches, launched a poorly coordinated attack against the British 6th Airborne Division's positions east of the Orne River. Instead of driving to the sea, the panzers became bogged down in small unit actions. that accomplished nothing beyond wasting precious time and resources, supplying operations. The unglamorous foundation of military success began functioning with increasing efficiency as the day progressed. The artificial harbors known as mulberries remained days away from deployment, but innovative beach organizations managed to land crucial ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies despite the continuing enemy fire. Quartermaster Corps personnel worked alongside combat engineers to establish supply dumps and evacuation points, their contributions as vital as any infantry advance. As reported in the official U.S. Army History Cross-Channel Attack, the most significant strategic achievement of D-Day was not territorial. The Allies controlled less than 50 square miles of French soil by nightfall, but psychological. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, supposedly impregnable, had been breached in a single day. German morale, already shaken by reversals in Russia and Italy, suffered another devastating blow as Goebbels' propaganda machine struggled to explain the disaster. The French civilian population's reaction to liberation varied dramatically by region and circumstance. In St. Mère-Église, Mayor Alexandre Renault welcomed American paratroopers with champagne hidden since 1940. However, in other areas, Allied bombing and artillery had caused civilian casualties that complicated the liberation narrative. The war's moral complexity was evident in villages where French families mourned their own dead, while celebrating freedom from German occupation. Individual acts of heroism continued throughout the afternoon as Allied forces consolidated their gains. Technical Sergeant Frank Perigori of the 116th Infantry Regiment single-handedly captured 35 German prisoners and eliminated 3 machine gun nests. During the advance inland from Omaha Beach, his Medal of Honor citation would later note that he inspired his entire company by his aggressive leadership and fighting spirit. The German High Command's response to D-Day revealed the fundamental weaknesses in Nazi decision-making. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group West, requested immediate release of armored reserves but was told that Hitler must personally authorize their deployment. The Führer, convinced that Normandy was a diversion from the real invasion at Pas de Calais, refused to commit his strategic reserves. This delay would prove catastrophic to German defensive prospects. By sunset on June 6th, Allied forces had achieved their primary objective, establishing sustainable beachheads that could resist German counterattacks and support the massive build-up required for the drive toward Germany. Over 150,000 men were ashore, with thousands more landing every hour. The Western Front, closed since Dunkirk 4 years earlier, had been triumphantly reopened. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, carried forward on the shoulders of young men who had proved themselves worthy of their cause and their destiny. The sun set over Normandy on June 6, 1944, casting long shadows across beaches littered with the debris of the greatest single day in military history. General Dwight David Eisenhower, standing in his Portsmouth headquarters, allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction as reports confirmed that Operation Overlord had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. The Atlantic Wall lay breached. Hitler's fortress Europe had been cracked open, and the long road to Berlin stretched ahead. The final casualty figures painted a sobering picture of victory's price. Allied losses totaled approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing, far fewer than the catastrophic predictions that had haunted planners for months. The 1st Infantry Division alone suffered over 2,000 casualties, most at Omaha Beach, while the airborne divisions lost nearly 2,500 men scattered across the Norman countryside. Each number represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future denied. German losses proved more difficult to calculate, but were significantly lighter than Allied casualties, a testament to the defensive advantages of prepared positions. However, the strategic impact of their defeat far outweighed the tactical arithmetic. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, racing back from Germany upon news of the invasion, arrived to find his carefully constructed defenses breached and his reserves committed piecemeal. The Desert Fox's reputation for tactical brilliance could not overcome the fundamental strategic error of fighting a two-front war. The success of D-Day rested on factors beyond military planning and individual heroism. The massive deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, continued to pay dividends as German intelligence insisted that Normandy was merely a diversion. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest force in France, remained deployed around Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Hitler's obsession with phantom threats allowed the Allies to consolidate their very real beachhead. French resistance networks, coordinated by the Special Operations Executive and Office of Strategic Services, contributed immeasurably to D-Day's success through sabotage operations that crippled German communications and transportation. The railway system throughout northern France ground to a halt as resistance fighters cut telephone lines, destroyed bridges, and ambushed German reinforcements attempting to reach the invasion beaches. Their sacrifice, often unrecorded and unheralded, proved as crucial as any conventional military operation. The technological superiority that would characterize the remainder of the war became evident on D-Day itself. Allied radar-guided fighter aircraft to intercept the few Luftwaffe sorties that challenged the invasion fleet. Superior communications allowed commanders to coordinate complex operations across 50 miles of coastline. Advanced landing craft delivered tanks and artillery directly onto hostile beaches, while innovative engineering equipment cleared obstacles that might have stalled previous generations of amphibious assaults. As documented in Winston Churchill's war memoirs, the Prime Minister spent D-Day in his map room, following reports from across Normandy while smoking an endless succession of cigars. His relief at the invasion's success was tempered by knowledge of the battles yet to come. The hedgerow country of Normandy would prove as challenging as any beach, and beyond that lay the Rhine, the heart of industrial Germany and Hitler's final redoubt. The human drama of D-Day extended far beyond the beaches and battlefields. In hospitals across southern England, surgeons worked frantically to save wounded men evacuated from the invasion beaches. In American and British homes, families gathered around radios to hear the first reports of the invasion, many learning for the first time that their sons and husbands were already committed to battle. The emotional weight of D-Day touched millions who never heard a shot fired in anger. The strategic implications of D-Day's success rippled across the global conflict. In Russia, Stalin finally received the second front he had demanded for 3 years, relieving pressure on the Red Army's advance toward Berlin. In the Pacific, Japanese leaders recognized that American industrial capacity could simultaneously support major operations in Europe and Asia, dimming hopes for a negotiated peace. As midnight approached on June 6th, the beaches of Normandy hummed with activity as supply ships unloaded equipment and reinforcements. The greatest gamble in military history had succeeded, but D-Day was merely the beginning of a campaign that would end only with Germany's unconditional surrender 11 months later. The young men who had stormed Hitler's Atlantic Wall had opened the door to victory, but walking through it would require months of additional sacrifice and heroism.